Following the collapse of Roman administrative authority, the Visigoths established a Germanic kingdom that initially operated under Arian Christianity, a theological framework that allowed for a relatively stable coexistence with existing Jewish populations. Legal records from the early Visigothic period, such as the Breviary of Alaric, indicate that Jewish communities maintained a distinct legal status, managing their own internal judicial affairs while contributing to the urban economy through commerce and craftsmanship. This stability shifted dramatically after the Third Council of Toledo in 589, when King Record I converted to Catholicism, initiating a series of restrictive legislative measures. The Visigothic Code, or Lex Visigothorum, gradually escalated from prohibiting intermarriage to the forced conversion mandates of King Sisebut in 613, which drove many practitioners into a clandestine existence or exile. The geopolitical landscape underwent a total transformation in 711, with the Umayyad conquest of Hispania. Under Islamic rule, the Jewish population was categorized as dhimmis, or protected people of the book, a status that required the payment of the jizya tax in exchange for religious autonomy and physical security. This administrative shift allowed for the restoration of communal structures that had been suppressed under late Visigothic rule. The Sephardic population began to concentrate in major urban centers like Córdoba, Lucena, and Seville, where they became integral to the intellectual and economic fabric of the Caliphate. By the 10th century, during the reign of Abd al-Rahman III, the Jewish community entered a phase of unprecedented scholastic growth. The appointment of Hasdai ibn Shaprut as a court physician and diplomat exemplified the high level of social integration achieved by Jewish elites within the Islamic bureaucracy. Intellectually, this era was defined by a synthesis of Hebrew linguistic studies and Arabic scientific methodologies. Scholars in the peninsula pioneered advancements in philology, refining Hebrew grammar by applying the systematic approaches used by Arab grammarians. The introduction of Greek philosophy, translated through Arabic intermediaries, prompted a revolution in Jewish thought, moving away from purely liturgical concerns toward metaphysical and scientific inquiry. Agricultural innovations brought by the Moors, such as advanced irrigation systems and new crop varieties like citrus and silk, expanded the commercial opportunities for Jewish merchants who linked Iberian markets with the broader Mediterranean trade routes. This period established the linguistic foundation of Ladino and the unique liturgical traditions that would distinguish Sephardic practice from other diaspora groups. The end of the Umayyad Caliphate and the rise of the Taifa kingdoms further decentralized this cultural energy, allowing various regional centers to develop their own specific rabbinical academies. By the time the Christian Reconquista began to push southward, the foundations of a distinct Sephardic civilization characterized by linguistic versatility, philosophical rationalism, and administrative expertise were firmly entrenched in the soil of the peninsula. The formation of the Portuguese kingdom as a sovereign entity distinct from Leon and Castile during the 12th century relied heavily on the strategic utilization of Jewish communal structures. As King Afonso Henriques prosecuted the territorial expansion known as the Reconquista, he encountered Jewish populations in captured urban centers who possessed advanced literacy, linguistic skills, and fiscal expertise absent among the warrior nobility. The Portuguese crown established a legal framework that recognized the comunas, granting Jewish communities a degree of self-governance in exchange for their role as the primary financial and administrative engine of the nascent state. This period was characterized by the appointment of a Rabbi Mor, or Great Rabbi, who served as an official state representative responsible for overseeing the judicial autonomy and tax collection of the various juderias scattered throughout the realm. The administrative partnership was formalized through the institution of the Tesorero Mor, where Jewish financiers managed the royal treasury and the logistics of military campaigns against the Almohad Caliphate. Kings such as Sancho I and Afonso II viewed the Jewish population not merely as a source of revenue, but as a stabilizing demographic capable of revitalizing depopulated border regions. Royal charters, or forai, often included specific protections for Jewish settlers, ensuring their safety and economic rights to encourage the resettlement of newly conquered territories. Unlike the feudal peasantry, the Jewish community occupied a unique vertical relationship with the monarch, categorized as servi camera nostrae, or servants of the royal chamber, which shielded them from local ecclesiastical jurisdiction and placed them under direct royal protection. The fiscal architecture of medieval Portugal was built upon Jewish participation in tax farming and the management of royal monopolies. The crown delegated the collection of indirect taxes and the administration of the salt and grain trades to Jewish agents, who utilized their trans-regional connections to secure liquid capital for the monarchy. This relationship enabled the Portuguese kings to bypass the constraints of the traditional landed aristocracy and the church, providing the sovereign with the financial independence necessary to consolidate centralized power. In exchange, the monarchy provided legal recourse for Jewish individuals through the ouvidor, a royal judge designated to handle disputes involving the Jewish community and the Christian majority. During the 13th century reign of King Dinas, the integration of Jewish expertise into the state reached its institutional peak with the expansion of the alfandegas, or customs houses, which were frequently staffed by Jewish officials. These individuals facilitated the maritime trade that would eventually turn Portugal toward the Atlantic, managing the export of wine, olive oil, and cork, while overseeing the import of textiles and metals. The crown's reliance on Jewish scholarship also extended to the development of early cartographic and navigational knowledge, which was deemed essential for the kingdom's security and future exploratory ventures. By the mid-14th century, this symbiotic arrangement had created a resilient administrative class that was inextricably linked to the survival and expansion of the Portuguese throne. The intellectual vitality of the Portuguese Jewish community reached its zenith during the 14th and 15th centuries, driven by a rigorous academic tradition that integrated secular sciences with religious exegesis. In the field of astronomy, Abraham Zacuto emerged as a pivotal figure, authoring the Ha-Hibur Ha-Zekut Ha-Gadol, a comprehensive set of astronomical tables that revolutionized celestial navigation. Zacuto's transition from the University of Salamanca to the Portuguese court facilitated the development of the copper astrolabe, a durable alternative to earlier wooden models that allowed for more precise measurements of the sun's altitude at sea. His perpetual almanacs provided the mathematical foundation for calculating latitude independently of land-based landmarks, a technical prerequisite for the oceanic expansion of the late 15th century. This data was further refined by the Junta dos Matemáticos, a specialized royal committee that included Jewish experts tasked with evaluating the feasibility of maritime routes. Medicine served as another cornerstone of Sephardic scholarly influence, with Jewish physicians dominating the royal households and public health sectors. These practitioners adhered to the Galenic Hippocratic tradition while incorporating original observations from the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna. The dissemination of pharmacological knowledge was enhanced by the work of Garcia de Orta, whose botanical studies, though published, later reflected the deep-rooted tradition of Jewish herbalism and clinical diagnosis in Portugal. Jewish doctors were instrumental in the creation of the Regimento do Proveito da Saúde, early public health guidelines aimed at mitigating the spread of contagious diseases in urban centers. This medical expertise was supported by a network of private libraries and translation circles that preserved classical anatomical texts, which were otherwise scarce in the northern European universities of the time. In the realm of philosophy and theology, Isaac Abravanel represented the height of Jewish humanism, blending Aristotelian logic with a critique of political structures. His commentaries on the Torah frequently addressed the nature of monarchy and statecraft, reflecting his own experiences as a high-ranking financial advisor to the Portuguese and Spanish crowns. Abravanel's thought emphasized the tension between temporal power and divine law, providing a philosophical framework that influenced both later Jewish thought and early modern political theory. Meanwhile, the School of Lisbon became a center for the study of Maimonidean rationalism, where scholars engaged in the reconciliation of faith with the empirical observations of the physical world. This intellectual environment was sustained by the development of Hebrew printing in cities like Faro and Lyria. were the first books ever printed in Portugal, such as the Pentateuch of 1487, were produced using advanced typography. The availability of these printed texts democratized access to specialized knowledge, ensuring that Portuguese Jewry remained at the forefront of the European intellectual vanguard prior to the forced disruptions of the 1492. The Jewish communities of Portugal and Castile functioned as a singular social and economic unit, transcending the formal political boundaries of the Iberian monarchies. This interconnectedness was predicated on a shared liturgical rite, the use of Hebrew as a lingua franca for documentation, and a complex network of consanguinity that linked prominent families across the border regions of Trás-os-Montes, Alentejo, and the Castilian Meseta. Commercial integration was facilitated by the letras de cambio, or bills of exchange, which allowed Jewish merchants to transfer significant capital between Lisbon, Toledo, and Burgos without the physical transport of bullion. This financial infrastructure supported the flourishing trade in wool, textiles, and raw silk, which moved fluidly through the Raya borderland. These frontier zones were not barriers but conduits, where Jewish communities often held dual loyalties or utilized familial ties to navigate the differing fiscal policies of the two crowns. The social cohesion of this trans-Iberian network was reinforced by the movement of rabbinical authorities and scholars between the academies of Lisbon and those in Salamanca or Córdoba. Legal decisions, or responsa, issued by Portuguese rabbis were frequently cited and implemented in Castilian courts, ensuring a standardized application of halakhic law across the peninsula. This judicial unity provided a stable environment for cross-border investments and the establishment of joint stock ventures in the maritime and agricultural sectors. Large-scale credit operations were often co-financed by Jewish syndicates from both kingdoms, pooling resources to fund royal initiatives or infrastructure projects like the expansion of the Douro and Tagus river trade. Marriage alliances played a critical role in maintaining this Sepharad connection, serving as a primary mechanism for the consolidation of communal wealth and the preservation of intellectual lineages. The Abravanel and Senior families, among others, utilized these unions to secure their influence at multiple courts, creating a transnational diplomatic elite. These families facilitated the flow of information regarding political shifts, tax reforms, and ecclesiastical movements, providing their communities with a strategic early warning system. The integration of the Portuguese and Castilian Jewish elites was so profound that during periods of political tension between the monarchies, these communal leaders often acted as mediators, leveraging their financial importance to maintain peace and the continuity of trade. Linguistically, the cross-border interaction fostered a commonality of expression, where the various Ibero-Romance dialects used by Jewish populations began to coalesce into a recognizable Sephardic vernacular. This shared culture was further cemented by the exchange of liturgical poetry and communal ordinances, which standardized the social behavior and religious expectations of individuals from Braga to Segovia. This robust network ensured that when the 1492 Edict of Expulsion was promulgated in Spain, the Portuguese Jewish community was not a foreign entity to the refugees, but a familial extension of their own social world, possessing the logistical readiness to absorb thousands of their counterparts within a matter of months. This pre-existing infrastructure of solidarity would prove to be the defining factor in the survival of the Sephardic tradition through the tumultuous final decade of the 15th century. The demographic and social equilibrium of the 14th century was severely disrupted by the arrival of the bubonic plague in 1348, an event that acted as a catalyst for escalating anti-Jewish sentiment across the Portuguese realm. As the Black Death decimated approximately one-third of the European population, the resulting systemic collapse of agricultural and commercial cycles triggered a search for communal scapegoats to explain the biological catastrophe. While the Portuguese monarchy, particularly Afonso IV, attempted to maintain public order through legal decrees, the erosion of traditional social hierarchies allowed for the proliferation of conspiratorial narratives regarding the contamination of communal water sources. These accusations, though lacking empirical basis, found fertile ground in an increasingly traumatized urban proletariat that viewed the relative insulation of the Judea areas partially a result of ritual hygiene and isolated living quarters with deep suspicion. Economic instability during the mid-1300s further exacerbated these communal divisions. The sudden contraction of the labor market and the ensuing hyperinflation of basic commodities led to a sharp increase in the indebtedness of the Christian peasantry and lower nobility to Jewish creditors. Unlike previous decades where such financial relationships were viewed as necessary components of the state's fiscal health, the post-plague environment reframed these debts as a form of social parasitism. The Cortes of Evora, in 1325 and subsequent legislative assemblies in Santarem began to reflect this populist shift, with delegates increasingly demanding the enforcement of the Sicut Judaeus papal bulls which, while protecting Jewish life, sought to strictly limit Jewish social and professional visibility. The later half of the century saw the introduction of the first systematic segregationist policies, notably the requirement for Jewish individuals to wear identifying badges, such as the yellow star or a red circle of cloth. This visual marking served to institutionalize the otherness of the community, facilitating more frequent episodes of harassment in public markets and shared commercial spaces. The 1,391 pogroms in neighboring Seville and Toledo sent shockwaves through the Portuguese borderlands, prompting a wave of defensive fortification within the comunas. Although the Portuguese crown did not yet officially endorse such violence, the increasing frequency of inflammatory sermons by mendicant friars began to challenge the traditional royal protection of the Jewish minority. These clerics utilized the socio-economic grievances of the urban poor to frame Jewish administrative presence as an affront to Christian morality. Legal restrictions also began to penetrate the professional sphere, with new ordinances restricting Jewish practitioners from holding certain public offices or participating in specific craft guilds. The 1372 witnessed a transition in royal rhetoric, as the monarchy started to view the Jewish community primarily through a fiscal lens of emergency taxation rather than long-term administrative partnership. This shift was codified in the Ordenações Afonsinas, which sought to standardize the legal disabilities of non-Christians. By the end of the century, the communal solidarity that had characterized the early medieval period had been replaced by a fragile and precarious tolerance, setting the stage for the more overt religious persecutions that would define the Iberian landscape in the coming century. The pandemic-induced collapse of social cohesion had effectively transformed the Jewish population from essential state allies into a marginalized class whose presence was increasingly debated in the halls of both the church and the Cortes. The rise of the House of Avis following the 1383–1385 crisis marked a pivotal shift in the relationship between the Portuguese state and the Jewish financial elite. King Juan I, monarch of the new dynasty, inherited a kingdom structurally weakened by civil war and persistent territorial disputes with Castile. To consolidate his authority and finance the ambitious expansionist policies that would define the 15th century, the crown deepened its reliance on a small, highly specialized group of Jewish tax farmers and fiscal administrators. This period saw the institutionalization of the arrendamento, a system where the right to collect royal taxes was auctioned to Jewish financiers, who provided the monarch with immediate liquid capital in exchange for the long-term proceeds of internal tolls and trade duties. This advance funding was a critical prerequisite for the 1415 conquest of Ceuta, an operation that initiated Portugal's overseas empire and required the rapid mobilization of naval and mercenary resources far beyond the capacities of the traditional feudal tithe. The administrative efficiency of the Avis state was spearheaded by figures such as the Almoxarifes, Jewish officials who managed regional warehouses and coordinated the distribution of essential supplies for the military. Juan I protected these individuals from the growing hostility of the urban municipios, recognizing that their trans-regional credit networks provided a level of fiscal stability that the agrarian nobility could not match. The Jewish elite of this era acted as the primary bridge between the Portuguese treasury and the international banking circles of Italy and Flanders, facilitating the procurement of strategic metals and timber, for the expansion of the royal shipyards in Lisbon. This financial mediation allowed the crown to implement a centralized monetary policy, standardizing the coinage and regulating the flow of bullion to ensure the solvency of the kingdom during periods of economic contraction. Despite the pragmatism of the monarch, the Avis period also introduced a complex dualism in royal policy. While the high-ranking Jewish advisors enjoyed unprecedented access to the royal court, the crown was simultaneously pressured by the Cortes to enforce more stringent social regulations. The 1400s saw the formalization of the Lei das Sete Partidas influence in Portuguese jurisprudence, which sought to prohibit Jewish individuals from exercising authority over Christians in non-fiscal matters. However, João I and his successors frequently granted cartas de privilegio, individual exemptions that allowed their Jewish financiers to retain their high-status positions and administrative functions despite these general prohibitions. This created a paradoxical social structure, where the Jewish elite remained essential to the mechanics of statecraft, while the broader Jewish population faced increasing legal isolation. The logistical demands of the burgeoning African trade further entrenched this dependence. As the Portuguese expanded their presence along the Maghreb coast, Jewish agents were tasked with managing the complex currency exchanges and diplomatic negotiations with local Muslim leaders. Their ability to operate in multiple linguistic and cultural zones made them indispensable for the establishment of the feitorias, or trading posts, that formed the backbone of the Avis economic model. By the reign of Duarte I and later Afonso V, the Jewish financial elite had moved from being temporary contractors to permanent architects of the Portuguese fiscal system. This integration ensured that the national expansion remained fiscally viable, even as the social tensions between the crown's administrative needs and the religious demands of the populace began to reach an unsustainable equilibrium. The formal authorization of the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition by Pope Sixtus IV in 1478, through the bull Exigit Sincere, Devotionis Affectus, fundamentally altered the existential security of the Jewish and converso populations in the Iberian Peninsula. Unlike earlier ecclesiastical courts, this institution was placed under the direct control of the Spanish monarchy, serving as a tool for political unification and religious standardization. The primary focus of the Inquisition was not the Jewish community itself, but the conversos Jewish converts to Christianity, who were suspected of practicing Judaizing rites in private. The establishment of the first tribunal in Seville in 1480, followed by the appointment of Tomás de Torquemada as Inquisitor General, signaled an unprecedented systematic approach to religious surveillance. This administrative shift institutionalized the auto da fe, a public act of penance that served as a psychological deterrent, projecting the state's power to penetrate the private domestic sphere of its subjects. The proximity of the Spanish tribunals created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety within the Portuguese borderlands. The Portuguese Jewish community, though theoretically protected by royal charters, witnessed the steady influx of conversos fleeing Spanish jurisdiction, bringing with them first-hand accounts of the San Benito and the confiscation of ancestral properties. These refugees sought asylum in Portugal, particularly in frontier towns like Elvas and Bragança, but their presence intensified the scrutiny of the Portuguese clergy, who began to advocate for the adoption of similar inquisitorial structures. The psychological impact was characterized by a transition from communal openness to strategic opacity. Families began to alter their domestic habits, suppressing visible religious indicators and adopting Christian nomenclature to avoid being linked to Spanish fugitives. Legally, the Spanish Inquisition introduced the concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which redefined religious identity from a matter of faith to one of biological heritage. This racialization of theology had profound implications for Portuguese society, as it challenged the traditional legal status of Jewish administrative allies and threatened the social standing of the new Christian elite. The Spanish monarchy utilized the Inquisition to consolidate assets and eliminate political rivals, creating a model of state-sponsored religious nationalism that resonated with the burgeoning Portuguese bourgeoisie. This new ideological framework viewed the Jewish presence not as a fiscal asset, but as a source of cultural contamination, undermining the medieval symbiotic relationship between the crown and the comunas. The constant threat of extradition and the expansion of the Spanish informer network meant that no Jewish community in Portugal was entirely beyond the reach of the Holy Office's influence. Financial assets were increasingly kept in liquid form or moved to northern European banking centers to prevent seizure by inquisitorial agents. This period of high-tension diplomacy saw King Juan II attempting to leverage his Jewish administrators' expertise while simultaneously navigating the demands of the Spanish Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, for the total elimination of Jewish influence in Iberia. The presence of the Inquisition in Spain effectively functioned as a permanent geopolitical shadow, transforming the Portuguese Juderias into sites of defensive vigilance. By the late 1482s, the psychological barrier between the two kingdoms had collapsed, as the ideological momentum of the Spanish Inquisition dictated the terms of the coming decade's catastrophic displacement. The promulgation of the Edict of Granada on the 31st of March 1492 by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon dismantled the remaining legal protections for the Jewish populations of Spain. This decree, issued following the fall of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, presented the Sephardic community with a binary choice: formal conversion to Catholic Christianity, or total departure from Spanish territories within a strict 4-month window ending on July 31. The primary administrative objective of the edict was the elimination of Jewish influence over the conversos, as the monarchy believed that continued proximity to practicing Jews encouraged recent converts to persist in their ancestral rites. This policy was executed with a level of bureaucratic precision that involved the immediate registration of Jewish property and the appointment of royal supervisors to oversee the liquidation of communal assets, including synagogues and cemeteries. Economically, the displacement was facilitated by the forced sale of real estate and fixed assets at significantly deflated values. Because the edict prohibited the export of gold, silver, or minted currency, departing families were required to convert their liquid wealth into bills of exchange or commodities such as textiles, hides, and tin. This restriction created a catastrophic loss of capital, as the massive influx of property onto the market drove prices down while the demand for exportable goods skyrocketed. The Spanish treasury benefited from this imbalance, collecting substantial exit taxes and acquiring abandoned communal properties for use as public buildings or ecclesiastical institutions. Estimates from the period suggest that roughly 200,000 individuals were affected, representing a demographic loss that decimated the urban craft and professional sectors of Castile and Aragon. The logistical execution of the exodus involved the coordination of thousands of families toward designated port cities and border crossings. Caravans moved toward the Mediterranean coast to board ships for the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, or the Italian peninsula, while the largest segment of the population turned westward toward the Portuguese frontier. The movement was characterized by the payment of significant transit fees to local noblemen and the crown, which viewed the refugees as a temporary source of revenue. In the final weeks of July, the roads of central Spain were congested with wagons and pack animals, carrying the essential tools of various trades, medical instruments, tailoring supplies, and scholarly manuscripts as families sought to preserve their professional identities in exile. For those choosing the Portuguese route, the border crossings at Badajoz, Ciudad Rodrigo, and Zamora became the focal points of the migration. The immediate displacement of such a large population created a regional humanitarian crisis, as the infrastructure of these border towns was insufficient to handle the sudden influx of thousands of refugees. Many Spanish Jewish families carried the keys to their abandoned homes as symbolic artifacts of their identity, a physical link to a society they had inhabited for over a millennium. This mass movement of 1,492 fundamentally altered the demographics of the Iberian Peninsula, shifting the center of Sephardic life toward the Portuguese kingdom, and creating the immediate conditions for the administrative and social crises that would follow in Lisbon and Evora. The abruptness of the decree ensured that the transition was not a managed migration, but a rapid and traumatic expulsion that severed the long-standing legal contracts between the Sephardic communities and the Spanish crowns. King Juan II of Portugal approached the 1492 Spanish refugee crisis with a strategy defined by fiscal opportunism and the preservation of royal prerogative. Recognizing the logistical impossibility of a total border closure, the monarch pivoted toward a policy of controlled entry designed to maximize state revenue while mitigating the social friction caused by a sudden population spike. The Crown established a formal admission tariff of 8 cruzados per adult, a substantial sum that targeted the liquid assets the exiles had managed to salvage from the liquidation of their Spanish properties. For the wealthy elite, particularly those with specialized technical or financial skills, Juan II offered a separate tier of residency permits at a premium of 100 cruzados, reflecting a deliberate effort to recruit high-value human capital into the Portuguese administrative and industrial sectors. This entry system was not an offer of permanent asylum, but a temporary transit permit valid for a duration of 8 months. The royal decree mandated that all refugees who paid the basic fee must utilize this period to arrange maritime transport to North Africa or the Ottoman Empire, effectively positioning Portugal as a profitable way station rather than a final destination. To enforce this timeline, the Crown appointed corregidores to oversee the registration centers at the border, where each individual received a physical token or written receipt as proof of payment. Failure to present these documents upon request or remaining in the kingdom beyond the 8-month grace period resulted in the immediate loss of legal status and the forfeiture of personal liberty, as the monarch reserved the right to enslave those who violated the transit terms. The fiscal impact of this admission policy was immediate and transformative for the Portuguese treasury. Contemporary administrative ledgers indicate that the collection of these entry fees provided the Crown with hundreds of thousands of cruzados, a windfall that Joan II directed toward the fortification of the North African praças and the continued funding of the maritime expeditions along the Guinea coast. This capital influx allowed the monarchy to maintain its geopolitical momentum at a time when traditional tax revenues were strained by the costs of centralizing the state. Furthermore, the king utilized the presence of the refugees to negotiate favorable terms with the Cortes, arguing that the increased population necessitated expanded royal authority over internal security and public health. Juan II also leveraged the specialized knowledge of the Spanish exiles to revitalize domestic industries, particularly the armaments and textile sectors. By granting selective permanent residency to master armorers, metalworkers, and physicians, the Crown bypassed the restrictive regulations of the local Christian guilds, which viewed the influx as a competitive threat. This pragmatic recruitment ensured that the most productive elements of the Spanish diaspora were integrated into the royal service, directly contributing to the technical superiority of the Portuguese military. Despite the xenophobic pressures from the urban municipalities and the clergy, the monarch maintained the entry policy as long as it served the state's economic interests, demonstrating a governance style that prioritized the structural expansion of the kingdom over the mounting religious and social anxieties of the populace. The administrative execution of the 1,492 border crossing was restricted to 5 official entry points: Melgaço in the north, Bragança, Almeida, Elvas, and Olivença. This geographic limitation was a deliberate structural measure intended to centralize the collection of the 8 cruzado tariff and to facilitate a comprehensive census of the incoming population. As the July 31 deadline approached, the narrow roads leading to these fortified passes became clogged with a massive volume of pedestrian and animal traffic, creating a bottleneck that overwhelmed the local infrastructures. The Portuguese crown dispatched military units to these frontier posts, not only to ensure order, but to prevent the entry of individuals through the dry border mountain paths, which would have bypassed the royal treasury's fiscal controls. The logistics of the processing centers were defined by a rigorous documentation protocol. Upon arrival, each refugee was subjected to an inventory of their physical possessions, as the export laws in Castile had already stripped them of bullion, leaving them with bulky commodities that required intensive inspections. Royal scribes, working in temporary wooden structures erected near the city gates, issued copper tokens and parchment certificates that functioned as temporary internal passports. These documents were essential for movement within the interior, as the Portuguese judicial system utilized them to distinguish legal transients from unauthorized stayers. The presence of these thousands of individuals in the arid frontier regions during the height of summer triggered immediate secondary crises in water procurement and the distribution of basic grain supplies, which had to be diverted from municipal granaries at inflated costs. Public health became a dominant administrative concern, as the concentration of people in makeshift camps led to the rapid spread of typhus and enteric fevers. The Crown implemented a primitive quarantine system, often forbidding the refugees from entering the walled centers of the border towns, forcing them instead to reside in suburban fields or temporary encampments. This spatial segregation was enforced by local bailiffs who monitored the sanitary conditions to prevent the contamination of urban wells. Simultaneously, the sheer volume of livestock accompanying the caravan's donkeys, mules, and goats exhausted the local grazing commons, leading to legal petitions from Portuguese farmers regarding the destruction of their winter forage. The frontier also became a site of intensive currency exchange and black market speculation. Since the Spanish exiles were prohibited from carrying minted coin, they relied on bartering their remaining textiles, books, and household metals for the Portuguese reais necessary to pay the entry tax and purchase provisions. This imbalance of trade allowed local merchants and royal officials to acquire high-value Spanish goods at a fraction of their worth. The border crossings thus functioned as a massive filter, stripping the refugees of their remaining liquid wealth and effectively subsidizing the local economies of the Alentejo and Beira regions. By the time the final caravans passed through the gates of Elvas, the Portuguese frontier had been transformed into a highly efficient extraction zone where the legal and physical reality of the exodus was codified into royal ledgers. The legal framework of 1492 defined the Spanish refugees as extranjeros aliens, under a strict contractual obligation to vacate the realm by the spring of 1493. This temporary asylum was a commercial agreement rather than a humanitarian intervention, governed by the expiration of the 8-month residency permits issued at the border. Upon crossing the frontier, the exiles were theoretically permitted to settle in various regions, but in practice, the Portuguese crown directed the majority of the population toward the southern and central provinces. This forced concentration facilitated the eventual logistical task of mass embarkation and allowed royal tax collectors to monitor the community's remaining assets. During this period, the refugees lived in a state of civil suspension, lacking the full communal rights held by the indigenous comunas and remaining subject to the direct, unmediated authority of the king's officers. The 8-month window required the exiles to navigate a rigid timeline of self-liquidation. Individuals were tasked with converting their remaining livestock, clothing, and household goods into the gold and silver necessary for ship passage, yet the domestic Portuguese market was already saturated with Spanish imports. This economic climate triggered a profound deflation of refugee-held assets, as Christian buyers, aware of the impending deadline, delayed purchases to extract the lowest possible prices. Consequently, the exiles found themselves in a fiscal trap where the cost of daily subsistence in Portugal consumed the very capital they required for their mandatory departure. The crown strictly prohibited the Spanish Jews from acquiring real property or entering into long-term agricultural leases, ensuring that their presence remained transient and their labor confined to low-status, immediate-term occupations. Logistical obstacles further complicated the departure mandate, as the availability of maritime transport was insufficient for the scale of the diaspora. King Juan II exercised a royal monopoly over the shipping lanes, requiring all vessels intended for the exodus to be chartered through the Casa da India or approved merchant syndicates. This centralization meant that the timing and cost of departure were entirely dictated by royal availability rather than market demand. Many families who possessed the financial means to leave were unable to secure space on the limited number of seaworthy carracks and caravels. Those who failed to obtain passage faced the mounting legal pressure of the Lei de Expulsão, which categorized individuals remaining past the deadline as state property. By the early months of 1493, the legal precariousness reached its terminal phase as the 8-month period drew to a close. The Portuguese administration transitioned from a posture of oversight to one of active enforcement, with the ouvidores beginning the process of identifying those who had not secured embarkation receipts. The status of the exiles was downgraded from protected transients to illegal residents, stripping them of any remaining judicial recourse. This deadline served as the primary mechanism for the king's eventual claim to communal assets, as the legal failure to depart provided the state with the justification for the mass confiscations and the enslavement of those who had nowhere else to go. The period of temporary asylum thus functioned not as a sanctuary, but as a deliberate administrative countdown that culminated in the total loss of legal personhood for the Spanish Sephardim on Portuguese soil. Following the expiration of the 1493 deadline, the Portuguese state reclassified thousands of Spanish Jewish refugees as royal slaves, an administrative status that allowed for their absolute mobilization as labor assets. King Juan II utilized this legal pretext to solve a persistent colonial challenge. The high mortality rates and labor shortages in the newly discovered equatorial island of São Tomé. Located in the Gulf of Guinea, the island was being developed as a primary center for sugar cultivation, but its environment was deemed unsuitable for European settlers. To populate the territory and establish a permanent Portuguese presence, the Crown ordered the systematic seizure of Jewish children from those families who had failed to secure maritime passage. Administrative records from the period indicate that approximately 2,000 children, aged between 2 and 10, were forcibly removed from their parents in the capital and other major centers. This operation was supervised by royal bailiffs and enforced by local military units, who processed the children through ecclesiastical checkpoints. Before embarkation, the children were subjected to mass baptism, a ritual intended to sever their religious and legal ties to the Jewish community and place them under the spiritual guardianship of the state. This theological reclassification was essential for the Crown's claim that it was acting in the interests of the children's salvation, while simultaneously utilizing them as a servile workforce for the Atlantic plantations. The logistics of the transport were handled by the Casa da Guiné, which coordinated the ships destined for the African coast. The children were treated as demographic capital, intended to eventually intermarry with local African populations to create a mixed-race intermediary class of lançados who would remain loyal to the Portuguese throne. Upon arrival in São Tomé, the survivors of the arduous voyage were distributed among the royal estates and private concessions. They were tasked with the clearing of tropical vegetation and the manual labor required for the processing of sugarcane, an industry that relied on intensive, year-round physical exertion in extreme climatic conditions. Historical accounts from contemporary chroniclers like Valentim Fernandes and Samuel Usk confirm that the mortality rate among these children was exceptionally high, driven by the prevalence of malaria and yellow fever. By 1499, it was reported that only a few hundred of the original 2,000 had survived the transition to the island's environment. Those who did survive remained legally bound to the land, their original familial identities replaced by a new social status as Christian subjects of the Crown. This systematic separation functioned as a tool of both colonial expansion and religious homogeny, effectively using the youngest members of the Sephardic diaspora as the foundation for the Portuguese sugar economy in the tropics. The São Tomé episode remains a stark example of the 15th century state's ability to weaponize family structures and religious conversion for the pursuit of maritime and economic objectives. The death of Juan II in October 1495 and the subsequent accession of Manuel I signaled a transition in the management of the Sephardic population, shifting from a policy of punitive extraction to one of strategic rehabilitation. Seeking to differentiate his governance from the harsh final years of his predecessor, Manuel I issued an immediate royal decree liberating the Spanish Jewish refugees who had been reduced to state slavery. This act of clemency was not purely humanitarian, but was rooted in a pragmatic assessment of the kingdom's economic requirements. The new monarch recognized that the continued enslavement or departure of these individuals would permanently drain the realm of the administrative, medical, and fiscal expertise essential for the burgeoning overseas empire. By restoring the legal personhood of the exiles, the crown successfully incentivized the return of Jewish capital into the public sphere, revitalizing urban markets that had stagnated under the threat of mass confiscation. The early months of Manuel's reign were characterized by a temporary restoration of the traditional medieval convivencia. The king actively courted the Jewish intellectual elite, maintaining the services of scholars like Abraham Zacuto and various prominent physicians who had been marginalized or threatened under the previous administration. In the royal court, the debate regarding the Jewish question was initially dominated by the Consejo de Estado, where many advisors argued that a tolerant environment was the most effective means of ensuring national prosperity. This period of relative stability allowed Jewish communities to reopen synagogues and resume communal self-governance under the authority of the Rabimor, providing a brief reprieve from the escalating xenophobia of the urban municipios. However, this policy of internal stabilization existed in direct tension with Manuel's external dynastic ambitions. The king's primary geopolitical objective was the unification of the Iberian crowns, a goal that necessitated a marital alliance with the Spanish Catholic monarchs. This diplomatic pursuit introduced a profound contradiction into Portuguese statecraft. The internal benefits of Jewish residency were increasingly incompatible with the religious requirements of the Spanish marriage contract. While Manuel I personally resisted the introduction of an inquisition or a total expulsion, viewing them as irrational from a fiscal perspective, his authority was curtailed by the explicit demands of Isabella and Ferdinand, who conditioned the hand of Princess Isabella of Asturias on the purification of the Portuguese kingdom from non-Christian elements. Administratively, the year 1496 served as a transition point where the royal chancery began to reconcile these conflicting interests through increasingly coercive legislation. The crown initially attempted to satisfy Spanish demands by intensifying the proselytization of Jewish communities, offering tax exemptions and social advancement to those who voluntarily converted. When these measures failed to produce a significant demographic shift, the royal rhetoric moved away from the inclusive stance of the 1495 coronation. The state began to inventory Jewish assets with renewed vigor, not for immediate seizure, but as a preparatory measure for a potential change in legal status. By the end of 1495, the precariousness of the Jewish position in Portugal had shifted from an issue of individual liberty to one of national identity, as the monarch prepared to sacrifice his most essential administrative allies for the prospect of an Iberian union. The diplomatic negotiations for the marriage between King Manuel I of Portugal and Princess Isabella of Asturias, the eldest daughter of the Catholic monarchs, were governed by the rigorous religious and political mandates of the Spanish crown. Following the death of Prince Afonso in 1491, the prospect of a dynastic union offered Manuel I a direct path to the potential inheritance of the thrones of Castile and Aragon, a geopolitical objective that superseded the internal administrative stability of the Portuguese state. However, Ferdinand and Isabella conditioned the marital alliance upon the absolute religious homogenization of the Portuguese realm. The Spanish monarchs viewed the presence of the Jewish community in Portugal as a direct threat to the efficacy of the Inquisition within their own territories, asserting that the open practice of Judaism across the border provided a sanctuary and a source of spiritual encouragement for Spanish conversos. The marriage contract, formalized in late 1496, explicitly required the purification of Portugal as a non-negotiable prerequisite for the union. This demand fundamentally challenged the traditional Portuguese legal doctrine of royal protection for religious minorities. While Manuel I initially attempted to propose alternative measures such as increased taxation or the further restriction of Jewish social liberties, Spanish diplomats remained inflexible, presenting the expulsion of the Jewish population as the only acceptable demonstration of Manuel's commitment to the Catholic faith and the Iberian Union. This external pressure placed the Portuguese monarch in a state of constitutional conflict, as the mass removal of the Jewish administrative class threatened to destabilize the fiscal machinery of the kingdom, just as the Atlantic maritime routes were reaching their peak profitability. The internal opposition to this demand was centered in the Conselho Real, where several high-ranking advisors cautioned against the economic repercussions of such a move. They highlighted the historical precedent of Jewish loyalty to the Avis dynasty and warned that the loss of medical, navigational, and financial expertise would primarily benefit Portugal's commercial rivals. Despite these warnings, the dynastic opportunity offered by the marriage remained the dominant factor in royal decision-making. The contract mandated that the expulsion be completed before the princess entered Portuguese territory, creating a rigid bureaucratic timeline that forced the royal chancery to begin drafting the necessary legal instruments for the termination of the Jewish communas. This period of negotiation saw the transition of the Jewish question from a domestic social issue to a primary instrument of international diplomacy. The Portuguese crown was forced to weigh the immediate structural benefits of Jewish residency against the long-term potential of a unified Iberian empire. By accepting the Spanish terms, Manuel I effectively traded the religious plurality of his kingdom for the legitimacy provided by the House of Trastamara. The demand for a pure kingdom thus functioned as a mechanism of ideological export, where the religious policies of the Spanish Inquisition were imposed upon the Portuguese state through the medium of a dynastic contract. The formalization of this agreement in the autumn of 1496 signaled the definitive end of the symbiotic relationship between the Portuguese monarchy and its Jewish subjects, setting the stage for the legislative upheaval that would follow in December. The official pronouncement of the expulsion of the Jewish and Muslim populations from Portugal was codified in the royal decree signed by King Manuel I in Mugue on the 5th of December 1496. This legislative act fundamentally abolished the medieval communal statutes, mandating that all practitioners of non-Christian faiths depart the realm or undergo Catholic baptism. Unlike the Spanish Edict of 1492, which provided a mere 4-month window, the Portuguese decree established a 10-month grace period, setting the final deadline for October 1497. This extended duration was an intentional administrative maneuver designed to provide the monarchy with sufficient time to organize the logistical transition of the community's assets, while simultaneously allowing the royal chancery to develop strategies for preventing a total demographic exodus. The decree specified that those choosing to leave were permitted to liquidate their fixed assets and export their wealth in the form of commodities or bills of exchange, provided they did not violate the standing royal prohibitions on the export of gold, silver, and other precious metals. To manage this process, the Crown established regional oversight committees tasked with registering the properties of the comunas and the individual judiciarias. This documentation was intended to prevent the localized spoliation of Jewish property by municipal authorities or the peasantry, ensuring instead that the proceeds of the departure were funneled through the royal fiscal system. The statute also clarified the status of the Jewish debt, requiring that all outstanding financial obligations between Jews and Christians be settled under the supervision of royal judges before the October deadline. A distinctive feature of the 1496 decree was its emphasis on the preservation of the kingdom's intellectual and technical infrastructure. While the text spoke of expulsion, the royal administration concurrently issued confidential instructions to local governors to identify Jewish individuals of extraordinary utility, particularly in the fields of medicine, cartography, and military engineering. These individuals were to be offered significant social and financial incentives to remain in Portugal as converts. This dual-track policy created a state of intense psychological pressure, as the public threat of expulsion was balanced against the private offer of assimilation. The decree effectively functioned as an ultimatum that shifted the burden of religious conformity from the state to the individual, using the 10-month window as a period of intensive proselytization. During this grace period, the Portuguese Church, supported by royal funding, increased the frequency and visibility of public sermons and theological debates within the Jewish quarters. These initiatives were designed to erode communal resolve by highlighting the social and legal benefits of conversion. Simultaneously, the Crown began the systematic closure of Hebrew printing presses and the restriction of certain communal religious services, signaling that the legal protections of the past were being incrementally dismantled well before the October 1497 deadline. This period of transition was characterized by a profound administrative ambiguity. While the law mandated departure, the state's logistical preparations for embarkation remained conspicuously stagnant, suggesting that the monarch's ultimate objective was not the removal of the population, but its total and forced integration into the body of the Christian state. The internal reaction of the Jewish communities in Lisbon, Évora, and Porto to the December 1496 decree was characterized by a systematic attempt to preserve communal integrity through spiritual and legal mobilization. In Lisbon, the administrative center of the Rabi Mor, the community leadership initiated a period of intensive liturgical mourning, which included the proclamation of public fasts and the recitation of penitential prayers, or selikat. These actions were not merely symbolic but served as a mechanism for reinforcing social cohesion in the face of impending legal dissolution. The urban synagogues, particularly the Sinagoga Grande in the Alfama district, became the focal points for these gatherings, where the community debated the feasibility of maritime departure versus the risks of remaining as clandestine practitioners. In Évora, a major center of Jewish scholarship and textile production, the reaction involved the rapid documentation and safeguarding of communal assets. Jewish families began the process of deeding their properties to trusted Christian acquaintances or seeking legal loopholes that would allow for the preservation of cemeteries, which were viewed as sacred and inviolable ground. The Juderia of Évora, known for its intellectual elite, saw a surge in the copying of sacred manuscripts and the clandestine distribution of religious texts intended for use in the diaspora. Historical records from the municipal archives indicate that the Jewish community in Évora also sought to leverage their historical service to the royal court, petitioning the local corregidor for clarification on the exportability of non-monetary assets such as looms and industrial dyes. Porto's Jewish community, strategically positioned for maritime trade, focused its efforts on the logistical evaluation of the northern Atlantic routes. The leadership in Porto's Rua Nova district engaged in covert negotiations with merchant captains from the Hanseatic League and England to secure passage, bypassing the state-monopolized shipping lanes in Lisbon. This period of mourning was accompanied by a deliberate reduction in public commercial activity, as Jewish merchants withdrew from the local fairs to focus on the liquidation of their inventories. The internal communal ordinances in Porto were updated to address the challenges of life in transit, providing guidance on the maintenance of dietary laws and ritual purity during long sea voyages. Throughout these major urban centers, the emotional weight of the decree manifested in the cessation of festive celebrations and the adoption of traditional mourning attire. The Jewish population engaged in a collective effort to finalize their spiritual affairs, which included the settling of communal dowries and the provision of financial assistance to the elderly and indigent who lacked the resources for emigration. In Lisbon, the Jewish elite utilized their remaining time to petition the royal chancery for the right to take their Hebrew libraries into exile, arguing that these texts were essential for the continuity of their judicial and religious traditions. This request, however, was met with increasing bureaucratic resistance, as the state began to view these intellectual assets as national property. The atmosphere in early 1497 was one of terminal uncertainty. While the communities prepared for a physical exodus, they were also forced to confront the potential erasure of their centuries-old communal presence in the Portuguese kingdom. The administrative strategy of King Manuel I during the early months of 1497 was defined by a fundamental contradiction: the public enforcement of the December decree and a clandestine state effort to prevent the actual departure of the Jewish population. While the royal chancery maintained the appearance of facilitating an exodus to satisfy the diplomatic conditions of the Spanish marriage contract, the monarch viewed the potential loss of Jewish human capital as a structural threat to the Portuguese state. This period was characterized by a series of strategic obstacles designed to paralyze the community's logistical preparations. By deliberately stalling the chartering of vessels and imposing restrictive maritime regulations, the Crown created a state of forced inertia, ensuring that the Jewish community remained within the realm as the October deadline approached. The rationale for this policy was rooted in the specific technical requirements of the Portuguese maritime expansion. The state relied on a network of Jewish specialists in cartography, metallurgy, and high-altitude celestial observation, who could not be replaced by the existing Christian labor pool. Royal advisors argued that the expulsion of these individuals would provide a significant technological windfall to Portugal's Mediterranean rivals, particularly the Ottoman Empire. To mitigate this risk, Manuel I implemented a dual-track administrative process, publicly promoting departure while privately authorizing the seizure of communal assets to render flight financially impossible. This systemic impoverishment was intended to leave the Jewish elite with no viable alternative but to accept Catholic baptism as a means of preserving their social status and professional functions. Furthermore, the Crown utilized the Jewish question to centralize its authority over the urban municipalities. By asserting direct royal jurisdiction over the Judi areas and their liquidation processes, the monarch bypassed the traditional judicial influence of the local nobility and the church. The state established a specialized bureaucracy to manage the converted assets, ensuring that the transition from a Jewish to a new Christian administrative class remained under the total control of the royal treasury. This administrative pivot effectively transformed the Jewish population from a religious minority into a state-managed professional caste whose skills were forcibly harnessed for the national interest under the guise of religious uniformity. To accelerate this forced integration, the Crown intensified the intellectual and social isolation of the communities. New ordinances prohibited Jewish individuals from engaging in cross-border trade or communicating with the Spanish conversos, effectively severing the trans-Iberian support networks that might have facilitated an escape. The state also began the systematic appraisal of Jewish libraries and scientific instruments, treating them as national heritage that could not be legally exported. This policy of cultural sequestration ensured that even if individuals managed to flee, the intellectual infrastructure of the community remained in Lisbon. By mid-1497, the royal policy had shifted from managing a departure to orchestrating a trap. The October deadline was no longer a day of departure, but a target for a mass, state-mandated conversion that would preserve the kingdom's expertise while satisfying the outward requirements of the Iberian Union. In the spring of 1497, the Portuguese crown implemented a decisive structural alteration to the expulsion decree by revoking the multi-port departure policy. Originally, the 1496 edict had implied that Jewish families could embark from various maritime hubs along the coast, including major commercial centers such as Porto and Lagos. However, a subsequent royal mandate abruptly centralized the entire process, designating Lisbon as the sole authorized point of embarkation for the entire Jewish population of the kingdom. This administrative funneling was a calculated measure to maximize state surveillance over the departing community and to concentrate the Jewish administrative and technical elite in one location where they could be more easily targeted for the crown's coercive conversion efforts. The logistical implications of this decree were catastrophic for the thousands of families residing in the northern and eastern provinces. Jewish communities in the Alentejo and the Beiras were forced to abandon their regional preparations and commence a secondary internal migration toward the Tagus estuary. This forced movement occurred during a period of high economic volatility, as the requirement to travel to Lisbon significantly increased the daily subsistence costs for refugees who had already liquidated their primary assets. The journey toward the capital was monitored by royal officials who collected transit tolls and ensured that no Jewish individuals diverted from the prescribed routes. By the summer of 1497, the population of Lisbon swelled as nearly 20,000 Jews from across the realm converged on the city, creating an unprecedented housing and public health crisis within the suburban districts. The centralization of the exodus in Lisbon allowed King Manuel I to exercise absolute control over the available shipping capacity. The royal chancery intentionally restricted the licensing of foreign vessels, ensuring that the number of ships docked at the Ribeira das Naus remained insufficient for the volume of people awaiting passage. This created a state of artificial congestion, where thousands of individuals were effectively trapped on the Lisbon waterfront, unable to fulfill their legal obligation to depart. While the state publicly claimed this was a result of maritime shortages and unfavorable wind patterns, in reality, the Crown utilized this bottleneck to prolong the Jews' presence in the capital, exposing them to continuous psychological and religious pressure from state-sponsored clerics and royal agents. Administratively, the closing of the ports facilitated a final, comprehensive inventory of the community's remaining portable wealth. As the refugees gathered at the designated embarkation zones, they were subjected to renewed inspections by the contadores of the royal treasury. Any items deemed to be of national strategic importance, specifically those related to maritime navigation or the burgeoning armaments industry, were earmarked for confiscation or forced purchase at state-dictated prices. The Tagus waterfront thus became the final site of fiscal extraction, where the legal reality of the expulsion was systematically replaced by the physical reality of a blockade. By narrowing the exit to a single, tightly controlled corridor, the Portuguese state ensured that the transition from a Jewish to a new Christian caste could be managed with industrial precision, moving the community away from the prospect of exile and toward the inevitability of a state-mandated baptism. The tactical consolidation of the Jewish population in Lisbon during the autumn of 1497 culminated in an orchestrated administrative entrapment at the Palace of Estaus, originally constructed as a residence for visiting dignitaries and later serving as the headquarters for the Inquisition. The palace and its adjacent courtyards were designated as the final staging area for those awaiting embarkation. Under the guise of finalizing maritime manifests and conducting a final census, royal officials directed approximately 20,000 individuals to gather within the palace precinct. Once the gates were secured, the administrative tone shifted from logistical processing to carceral containment, as military units established a perimeter that prevented any unauthorized egress from the complex. The legal mechanism of this containment relied on the strategic withholding of the promised ships. While the Tagus River remained visible from the palace grounds, the Royal Navy remained anchored and inactive, effectively nullifying the refugees' ability to comply with the legal deadline for departure. Inside the Estaus complex, the state implemented a policy of systematic deprivation, restricting the delivery of water and rations to induce a state of physical exhaustion and psychological vulnerability. Royal scribes and high-ranking clerics circulated among the detainees, presenting the act of Catholic baptism as the sole means of regaining liberty and accessing basic necessities. This environment of enforced desperation was a deliberate bypass of the 10-month grace period's voluntary conversion goals, replacing persuasion with the structural pressures of a siege. The administrative pressure was further intensified through the selective removal of communal leaders and scholars. By isolating the rabbis and elder statesmen of the communas in separate quarters of the palace, the state sought to erode the social cohesion of the massed population, depriving them of the legal and spiritual counsel necessary to maintain their resolve. During this period of detention, the royal chancery issued several Alvarez decrees that retroactively justified the suspension of the Jews' right to exile, citing the unforeseen logistical failures of the maritime fleet. This created a legal vacuum where the Jewish community was neither permitted to leave nor recognized as having any standing within the kingdom, rendering them entirely dependent on the king's mercy through conversion. The Estaus episode functioned as a laboratory for the state's transition to a religiously uniform society. As the October deadline passed, the monarch's representatives informed the gathered thousands that their window for departure had legally closed, and they were now considered state property unless they accepted the faith of the crown. The systematic prevention of boarding was the final component of a trap that had begun with the closing of regional ports months earlier. By concentrating the diaspora in a single controlled urban space, Manuel I successfully converted a potential demographic loss into a captive administrative asset. The palace thus served as the site where the medieval contract between the Portuguese throne and the Jewish community was definitively terminated, replaced by the coerced integration that would define the era of the New Christians. The culmination of the October 1497 deadline was the execution of forced mass baptisms, a procedure that fundamentally replaced the legal category of Jew with that of New Christian through a standardized liturgical act. As the deadline for departure arrived, the state abandoned the pretense of providing maritime transport and instead initiated a series of violent, non-consensual conversion rituals across the urban centers of Portugal. In Lisbon, military units moved into the courtyards of the Palace of Estaus and the Rocio Square, where the trapped Jewish population was subjected to a communal sprinkling of holy water. This methodology utilized a broad theological interpretation of the sacrament, asserting that the physical contact with consecrated water, even under duress, constituted an irrevocable spiritual and legal transformation. The logistical execution of these baptisms was characterized by the collapse of individual documentation in favor of collective reclassification. Rather than the traditional individual baptismal ceremonies performed in parish churches, the royal administration employed high-ranking clergy to perform mass ablutions on thousands of people simultaneously. Royal scribes worked alongside the clergy, updating tax rolls and census records in real time to reflect the new Christian names assigned to the former Jewish communities. This bureaucratic transition was essential for the Crown's objective of maintaining the administrative continuity of the kingdom. By legally erasing the Jewish status of its subjects, the state could theoretically retain their professional services while fulfilling the outward religious requirements of the Iberian dynastic union. Physical coercion was a systemic component of the process, as individuals who resisted the ritual were frequently subjected to manual force by royal bailiffs. Historical accounts from the period, including those of the chronicler Damian de Gois, describe scenes where individuals were dragged by their hair to the baptismal fonts or had holy water poured over them in the streets. This violence was legally sanctioned by the Crown, which argued that the preservation of the kingdom's religious unity outweighed the medieval principles of voluntary conversion. The state also implemented a policy of nominal conversion, where the mere presence of a Jewish person during a mass liturgical event was deemed sufficient for their legal reclassification as a Christian, regardless of their internal conviction or verbal consent. The immediate result of these mass baptisms was the creation of a massive, socially distinct class of Cristãos Novos. This new legal identity carried profound implications for the Portuguese judicial system, as it subjected the population to the authority of the canon law and eventually the oversight of the ecclesiastical courts. The synagogues that had served as the focal points of Jewish life were immediately seized by the state and reconsecrated as churches, their ritual objects confiscated as recovered Christian property. By the end of October 1497, the official presence of the Jewish faith had been administratively extinguished in Portugal. This state-mandated ritual effectively functioned as a demographic seizure, permanently binding the Sephardic intellectual and financial elite to the Portuguese throne through a forced sacramental contract. The final phase of the 1497 administrative conversion was met with localized but significant acts of physical and spiritual defiance that challenged the state's claim of religious uniformity. While the royal chancery utilized mass sprinkling of water to reclassify the population legally, a subset of the Sephardic community pursued the principle of Kiddush Hashem, or the sanctification of the divine name, through ultimate self-sacrifice. Historical documentation from contemporary Jewish chroniclers and diplomatic reports from the era indicate that the Rocio Square and the Palace of Estaus became sites of active resistance, where individuals opted for mortality over the acceptance of a Christian legal identity. These acts were not merely personal choices, but functioned as a final, definitive rejection of the Crown's breach of the 1496 exit contract. Among the notable instances of high-status resistance was the case of Chief Rabbi Simon Mamie and several other prominent scholars who were detained separately to break the community's morale. When presented with the ultimatum of baptism or death, Mamie and his colleagues maintained an absolute refusal, leading to their prolonged incarceration and eventual death under custodial duress. The state's inability to secure the conversion of the highest-ranking religious authority in the realm represented a significant failure of the royal proselytization program. These leaders were buried in unconsecrated ground, yet their deaths provided a symbolic framework for the broader communal resistance that persisted even as the majority were forced into the new Christian caste. In the urban centers of Lisbon and Évora, reports describe families who utilized the high walls of their residential quarters or the depths of communal wells to commit acts of mass suicide. These actions were intended to prevent the forced baptism of children and to ensure that the final act of the family unit remained within the Jewish tradition. Unlike the earlier episodes of 1492, where families had time to settle their spiritual affairs before exile, the 1497 events occurred with a degree of suddenness that left little room for organized flight. Consequently, the resistance of 1497 was defined by its immediacy and its focus on preserving religious integrity at the cost of biological survival. The Portuguese crown attempted to suppress reports of these suicides to maintain the diplomatic fiction of a bloodless and successful conversion process intended for the Spanish court. Beyond physical death, resistance manifested in the deliberate destruction of ritual objects to prevent their desecration or seizure by the state. As synagogues were being reconsecrated as churches, many Jewish families opted to burn their Torah scrolls and bury their liturgical silver rather than allow these items to be repurposed as ecclesiastical trophies. This scorched earth approach to religious property ensured that while the state could seize the buildings, it could not inherit the living artifacts of the Sephardic tradition. Furthermore, a small number of individuals managed to reach the Atlantic coast in the northern provinces, attempting to board foreign vessels in defiance of the royal blockade. These fugitives faced severe legal penalties, including execution or perpetual galley service if captured. Yet they continued to seek maritime escape until the final closure of the borders was fully enforced by the royal guard. This period of resistance demonstrated that despite the state's totalizing administrative power, the transition to religious homogeneity was marked by a persistent and tragic refusal to acknowledge the validity of the forced sacrament. The administrative aftermath of the 1,497 mass baptisms necessitated the creation of a new sociological and legal category, the Cristãos Novos, or New Christians. This classification was a legal fiction because it assumed a total religious transformation while simultaneously maintaining a distinct bureaucratic identity for the former Jewish community. To protect the kingdom's structural stability, King Manuel I issued a royal decree in May 1497, granting the New Christians a 20-year grace period, during which no inquiry would be made into their private religious practices. This moratorium was an essential state maneuver to prevent immediate inquisitorial interference, ensuring that the recently converted administrative and financial elite remained productive and anchored within the Portuguese state. Under this new legal framework, the former members of the comunas were theoretically granted parity with old Christians, including the right to own real property, enter craft guilds, and attend universities. However, the state maintained separate fiscal ledgers for these individuals, often subjecting them to voluntary contributions or special levies to fund the burgeoning overseas expeditions. The transition was managed by the Chancelleria Real, which oversaw the integration of New Christians into the municipal bureaucracies. Despite their new baptismal names, these individuals were often referred to in public documents by their biological lineage, a practice that institutionalized a social divide within the Portuguese populace. The Crown utilized this ambiguity to bypass traditional noble privileges, appointing new Christian officials to key positions in the customs houses and the colonial administration of the Estado da India. Socially, the creation of the new Christian class prompted a reorganization of the urban landscape. While the formal walls of the judiciarias were dismantled, the population often remained concentrated in specific districts out of economic necessity and the need for familial support networks. The Portuguese judiciary faced a persistent challenge in resolving disputes over pre-expulsion debts and property rights. The legal erasure of Jewish identity made it difficult to enforce traditional Sephardic contracts in Christian courts. To address this, the monarchy encouraged the adoption of Christian professional identities, providing incentives for new Christians to dominate the expanding sectors of international finance and pharmaceutical trade. This professional specialization ensured that the former Jewish community remained an isolated but vital component of the state's economic engine. The tension of this legal fiction was most apparent in the realm of marriage and inheritance. The crown initially permitted new Christians to marry within their own groups, a policy that inadvertently facilitated the preservation of Sephardic social codes and clandestine religious knowledge. This endogamy became a focal point of criticism from the old Christian clergy, who argued that the state was facilitating a heretical nation within the kingdom. By the turn of the 16th century, the legal category of Cristone Novo had become a permanent hereditary marker, signifying a population that was religiously Christian in the eyes of the law, but socially and genealogically Jewish in the eyes of society. This administrative limbo functioned as a temporary stabilizing force, allowing the Portuguese state to transition into a global empire while postponing the inevitable theological and social conflicts that would explode during the 1506 Lisbon massacre and the subsequent formal establishment of the Inquisition. The formal abolition of Judaism in 1497 was accompanied by the systematic liquidation of the physical infrastructure of the comunas, primarily the synagogues and communal houses of prayer. Under the legal principle of incorporação real, the Portuguese crown asserted immediate ownership over all religious real estate previously held by Jewish communities. This process was not merely a confiscation of property, but a deliberate spatial strategy intended to erase the visible landmarks of non-Christian worship from the urban landscape. Royal decrees mandated that these structures be repurposed to serve the ideological and practical needs of the Catholic state, leading to a wave of structural renovations that replaced Hebrew inscriptions and ritual orientations with the iconography and architectural requirements of the Church. In Lisbon, the Sinagoga Grande of the Alfama, which had served as the spiritual and judicial heart of the kingdom's Jewry, was immediately reconsecrated as the Church of Nossa Senhora da Conceição. The administrative transition involved the removal of the Hechal, the Ark for Torah scrolls, and the installation of a central altar, effectively reorienting the building's internal focus toward the requirements of the Catholic liturgy. Similar transformations occurred in the northern hubs. In Porto, the synagogue located in the Olival district was granted to the Order of the Clarissas, eventually being incorporated into the footprint of the monastery of São Bento da Vitória. These reconsecrations served a dual purpose. They provided the Church with established urban real estate while physically demonstrating the triumph of the new religious order over the eradicated faith. Beyond ecclesiastical repurposing, many smaller synagogues and communal buildings in provincial towns like Tomar, Castelo de Vide, and Belmonte were converted into secular utilitarian spaces. These structures were often repurposed as municipal warehouses, prisons, or royal granaries, stripping them of their sacred character through the imposition of mundane commercial functions. In Tomar, the 15th century synagogue, unique for its sophisticated acoustics and architectural proportions, was utilized as a storage facility for agricultural equipment, and eventually as a private residence, a common fate for buildings located outside the primary urban parishes. This secularization prevented the clandestine gathering of new Christians in spaces that retained ancestral religious associations, effectively neutralizing the buildings as potential sites of subversion. The liquidation of the comunas also extended to the Jewish cemeteries, which were viewed as valuable suburban land assets. The Crown frequently authorized the removal of gravestones and the leveling of burial grounds to facilitate the construction of new defensive works or public plazas. In Lisbon, the cemetery of the Judiaria was largely destroyed to allow for urban expansion, with the stone markers often recycled as building materials for the city's waterfront fortifications. The systematic desecration of these sites represented a definitive rupture with the Sephardic past, ensuring that no physical repositories of communal memory remained to anchor the new Christian population to their pre-1497 identity. By the end of the 15th century, the architectural map of Portugal had been scrubbed of its Jewish topography, replaced by a network of converted institutions that functioned as the structural scaffolding for the religiously homogenized Avis state. The mandatory reclassification of the Jewish population in 1497 was accompanied by a systematic state-led effort to eradicate the intellectual and linguistic foundations of Sephardic culture. Central to this cultural severance was the prohibition of the Hebrew language in both liturgical and administrative contexts, a measure designed to prevent the transmission of secret religious knowledge and to enforce the total integration of the new Christian class. The Portuguese crown viewed Hebrew literacy as the primary vehicle for maintaining a distinct communal identity, and as such, the royal chancery initiated a comprehensive confiscation of all non-medical Hebrew manuscripts. This policy targeted not only the Torah scrolls seized from converted synagogues, but also private collections of halakhic law, rabbinical responsa, and ethical treatises, effectively decapitating the community's scholarly leadership. The suppression of the Jewish intellectual tradition was particularly evident in the dismantling of the Hebrew printing industry. By late 1497, the advanced presses in Faro, Leiria, and Lisbon, which had pioneered the use of movable type in Portugal, were either decommissioned or repurposed for the production of Catholic devotional literature. This destruction of the physical means of knowledge production ensured that the Sephardic population could no longer circulate standardized religious texts or educational manuals. Furthermore, the state implemented a ban on the importation of Hebrew books from Italy and the Ottoman Empire, establishing a strict censorship regime managed by royal inquisitors and the customs houses. The loss of these texts represented a definitive break with the Mediterranean intellectual network that had sustained Sephardic rationalism for centuries. Scientific assets were also subject to state appropriation, as the crown sought to preserve the utility of Jewish knowledge while erasing its ethnic origins. Instruments of celestial navigation, cartographic charts, and astronomical tables previously owned by Jewish specialists were reclassified as royal property. The specialized expertise required to interpret these materials was forcibly redirected into the service of the Armada de India, where new Christian astronomers were required to teach their methodologies to old Christian pilots under the supervision of state officials. This selective preservation ensured that the Portuguese maritime expansion continued uninterrupted, even as the cultural world that had produced these innovations was being systematically dismantled. Educational reform served as the final mechanism of this cultural erasure. The traditional yeshivot and communal schools were replaced by parish-based instruction, focusing on Latin and Catholic dogma. The crown strictly prohibited the private tutoring of Hebrew, treating the teaching of the language to the younger generation as an act of religious subversion. By the early 16th century, the professional and intellectual lineage of the Sephardim had been fractured. While many individuals retained their specialized skills, the shared linguistic and philosophical framework that had bound the community together was largely extinct. This intellectual liquidation transformed the Portuguese Jews from a self-sustaining scholarly society into a fragmented workforce whose ancestral traditions were preserved only in the distorted records of the state's judicial and ecclesiastical archives. By the conclusion of 1497, the Portuguese kingdom had undergone a comprehensive structural reconfiguration, as the legal and visible presence of Judaism was effectively erased from the public sphere. The immediate aftermath of the forced conversions was defined by the total vacancy of the Judaias, which had transitioned from vibrant communal centers to silent urban districts under direct royal administration. The Portuguese state implemented a policy of physical erasure, removing the Hebrew signage from commercial stalls and replacing Jewish communal insignias with the heraldry of the Avis dynasty. This period marked the definitive end of the convivencia model, as the state sought to institutionalize a new social order, where the distinction between old and new Christians became the primary axis of demographic classification. The economic landscape of 1497 was characterized by the integration of former Jewish capital into the broader national economy. Though this transition was fraught with fiscal volatility, new Christians, now legally permitted to participate in sectors previously restricted to the Christian majority, began to enter the merchant guilds and the municipal councils. However, the Portuguese treasury maintained a rigorous system of surveillance over these assets to ensure that the wealth of the former comunas remained within the realm. The royal chancery issued a series of directives prohibiting new Christians from selling their fixed property or transferring large sums of currency to foreign accounts, effectively anchoring the community to the Portuguese economy as a captive professional class. This policy of economic containment was essential for the Crown's ability to finance the Vasco da Gama expedition and the subsequent establishment of the Carrera de India. Ecclesiastical authority expanded significantly during this immediate post-conversion period, as the Church was tasked with the spiritual oversight of thousands of reluctant converts. The Portuguese episcopate established a network of monitors within the former Jewish quarters, responsible for ensuring that the new Christians attended Mass and adhered to the Catholic liturgical calendar. This era saw the first systematic attempts to reform the domestic space of the former Jews, with new ordinances encouraging the removal of traditional kitchen implements and the adoption of Christian dietary customs as a public demonstration of loyalty. The visible signs of the faith were replaced by the mandatory display of crucifixes and saints' images in windows and doorways, transforming the aesthetic of the city streets into a uniform expression of Catholic orthodoxy. The social climate of 1498 was one of profound tension between the Crown's administrative pragmatism and the populist resentment of the old Christian majority. While King Manuel I continued to protect the new Christian elite to preserve the state's intellectual infrastructure, the lower classes viewed the sudden professional mobility of the converts with hostility. This friction led to the enactment of the first purity of blood statutes in certain local confraternities and military orders, which sought to create informal barriers to new Christian advancement despite their legal equality. The year following the conversions ended with the Portuguese kingdom poised on the edge of a new imperial era, its internal religious diversity sacrificed for a dynastic union that had fundamentally altered the social, legal, and spiritual character of the nation. The Sephardic world had not vanished, but had been driven into a clandestine existence, marking the beginning of a centuries-long struggle to preserve identity beneath a mandatory veil of Christian conformity. The structural elimination of open Judaism in 1497 necessitated the development of crypto-Judaism, a complex system of clandestine religious preservation that operated behind a facade of Catholic orthodoxy. This phenomenon was defined by the transition of Jewish life from the communal sphere to the domestic interior, where the family unit replaced the synagogue as the primary repository of ancestral tradition. New Christians developed a sophisticated repertoire of behavioral adaptations designed to evade the surveillance of ecclesiastical monitors and neighbors. These practices included the subtle modification of Christian rituals, such as the lighting of Sabbath candles inside deep vessels or closets, to prevent the visibility of the flames from the street. The domestic architecture of the former Jewish quarters was incrementally adapted with concealed spaces and double-walled compartments intended for the storage of any remaining prayer shawls or dietary utensils that survived initial confiscations. Halakhic observance was fundamentally transformed by the absence of a visible calendar and the loss of the rabbinical elite. In this environment, the transmission of religious knowledge became increasingly matriarchal, as women assumed the responsibility for maintaining dietary restrictions, or kashrut, through the careful inspection of meat and the avoidance of prohibited fats under the guise of specific culinary preferences. The traditional Saturday Sabbath was frequently masked by performing visible manual labor in public, while abstaining from work within the privacy of the home. Furthermore, the celebration of major festivals like Yom Kippur and Passover was shifted to slightly different dates to decouple them from the traditional Jewish calendar, a measure intended to mislead any external observers tracking communal patterns. This calendrical drift ensured that the rhythms of Jewish life continued even as the official state records documented a fully Christian populace. Linguistic and symbolic camouflage also played a critical role in the maintenance of this secret identity. While the public use of Hebrew had been eradicated, new Christians incorporated specific liturgical fragments and biblical allusions into their Portuguese speech, creating a coded vernacular that allowed for the identification of fellow practitioners. The recitation of the Psalms became a primary spiritual outlet, as these texts were shared by both traditions, allowing new Christians to pray in public while maintaining a private Jewish intent, a concept later defined in inquisitorial records as mental reservation. This theological pivot allowed the community to participate in the external requirements of the Church, such as baptism, confession, and the Eucharist, while internally categorizing these acts as empty gestures performed under duress to ensure physical survival. The emergence of crypto-Judaism created a permanent state of social duality that fundamentally challenged the state's claim of religious homogeneity. The Portuguese crown, while initially tolerating the new Christian class for fiscal reasons, remained structurally suspicious of the persistence of these clandestine rites. This institutional anxiety led to the eventual development of the visitadores, itinerant ecclesiastical inspectors tasked with identifying Judaizing tendencies through the monitoring of specific domestic behaviors, such as the changing of linens on Fridays or the refusal to eat pork. By the early 16th century, the crypto-Jewish tradition had become a resilient underground culture, possessing its own unique oral traditions and survival strategies that would allow the Sephardic legacy to persist in Portugal for centuries, despite the mounting judicial pressures of the forthcoming Inquisition. The formal abolition of the Jewish communal status in 1497 triggered an immediate period of fiscal volatility, as the Portuguese crown sought to decouple the kingdom's financial infrastructure from its traditional religious foundations. The primary economic disruption was characterized by a sharp contraction in credit availability. The uncertainty surrounding the legal standing and assets of the newly converted Cristãos Novos led to a temporary freeze in cross-border capital transfers. Local municipal records from Lisbon and Porto indicate a significant drop in the collection of indirect trade taxes, as merchants paused operations to navigate the transition from the old comunas to the individual professional status mandated by the king. This interruption threatened the liquidity of the royal treasury at a critical juncture, specifically as the costs associated with the consolidation of the Estado da India began to escalate. To mitigate this systemic shock, Manuel I implemented a policy of controlled recovery that prioritized the continuity of the Jewish administrative apparatus under its new Christian guise. The crown issued royal decrees that protected the validity of pre-1497 contracts, ensuring that the transition did not result in a mass repudiation of debts owed to the former Jewish financiers. This legal continuity was essential for the recovery of the internal market, as it allowed the new Christian merchant elite to maintain their roles as the primary tax farmers and suppliers for the Royal Navy. By the year 1500, the Portuguese fiscal system had largely stabilized, with the new Christian class emerging as the dominant force in the high-stakes spice trade, utilizing their existing international networks in Antwerp and Venice to facilitate the distribution of pepper and cloves. However, this recovery was unevenly distributed, as the traditional agricultural sectors suffered from the loss of regional Jewish capital. In the Alentejo and Beira regions, the dismantling of the Jewish comunas led to the decay of localized credit systems that had previously supported seasonal harvests and small-scale textile manufacturing. Many small-scale Jewish artisans, now stripped of their communal mutual aid societies, struggled to compete with the established Christian guilds, resulting in a gradual shift toward low-skill agricultural labor. The state attempted to address this regional imbalance by granting new Christians specific commercial monopolies in the leather and cork industries, effectively using state intervention to replace the organic economic activity that had been disrupted by the 1496 decree. The long-term recovery of Portuguese commerce was also fueled by the influx of recovery taxes and the systematic recycling of confiscated communal wealth. The crown utilized the proceeds from the reconsecration of synagogues and the sale of cemetery lands to fund the modernization of the Lisbon shipyards. This capital injection allowed for the construction of larger, more durable vessels capable of the long-haul voyages required for the Cape route. By the early 16th century, the Portuguese economy had transitioned from a diverse mosaic of regional markets into a highly centralized, state-managed mercantile system. While the Jewish community had ceased to exist legally, its expertise and capital remained the foundational pillars of the Portuguese maritime empire, ensuring that the national recovery was inextricably linked to the professional success of the new Christian class. The socio-political stability of Lisbon was catastrophically disrupted in April 1506 by a convergence of environmental and biological crises, including a prolonged drought, subsequent famine, and a resurgence of the bubonic plague. These conditions created a volatile atmosphere in which the new Christian population, despite their legal conversion nearly a decade prior, served as a primary target for systemic public frustration. The violence was triggered on April 19, during a Sunday service at the convent of São Domingos. A luminous phenomenon appearing on a crucifix was interpreted by the old Christian congregation as a divine miracle. However, a new Christian present remarked that the light was merely a physical reflection of a candle. This rationalist observation was immediately denounced as heresy, and the individual was dragged from the church and executed by the mob. The incident escalated into a statewide massacre as members of the Dominican order, specifically Fray Juan and Fray Bernardo, incited the populace with inflammatory sermons. The friars carried a crucifix through the streets, promising 3 days of religious indulgences to any citizen who participated in the purging of heretics from the city. The ensuing violence resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians over a 72-hour period. The massacre was characterized by its extreme brutality and lack of judicial oversight. Victims were systematically dragged from their residences, and massive pyres were constructed in the Rocio Square to incinerate the bodies of the slain. The urban proletariat was joined by foreign sailors from German, Dutch, and French vessels anchored in the Tagus, who participated in the slaughter to facilitate the looting of new Christian commercial assets. King Manuel I was absent from the capital during the uprising, having relocated the royal court to Abrantes to escape the contagion. The absence of the sovereign allowed the violence to proceed with minimal resistance from local administrative authorities, who were either overwhelmed or ideologically aligned with the rioters. When reports of the total collapse of public order reached the king, he responded with significant judicial severity to reassert royal prerogative. He ordered the execution of the 2 instigating friars and the arrest of several municipal officials who had failed to maintain the peace. Furthermore, the monarch imposed a collective punishment on the city of Lisbon, temporarily revoking its municipal privileges and stripping the Casa dos 24, the representative body of the trade guilds, of its administrative power. The 1506 massacre demonstrated the total fragility of the legal New Christian status. It revealed that the 1497 decree had failed to transform the Sephardic elite into an accepted component of the social fabric, instead creating a visible and vulnerable class that could be weaponized during periods of national emergency. This explosion of violence served as a critical precursor to the eventual establishment of the Portuguese Inquisition, as the Crown realized that the Jewish problem remained a source of permanent civil instability. The massacre effectively ended the period of relative domestic peace that had followed the forced baptisms, prompting a new wave of clandestine emigration as new Christians sought to flee a kingdom where legal conversion no longer guaranteed physical safety. The years following the 1506 massacre catalyzed a transition from internal concealment to systemic clandestine emigration as the Portuguese New Christian class sought to bypass the royal prohibitions on departure. To preserve the kingdom's capital and technical expertise, the Crown had enacted the law of the 14th of June 1499, which strictly forbade new Christians from selling their land or transferring funds abroad without a specific royal license. This legislative barrier forced the diaspora to adopt a mercantile strategy of liquidation through trade, where families utilized the burgeoning Atlantic and Mediterranean shipping lanes as conduits for escape. By securing cargo space under the guise of legitimate commercial ventures for the Casa da India, many new Christian families effectively laundered their domestic assets into portable commodities, like spices and textiles, which were then diverted to foreign ports. The Ottoman Empire emerged as the primary destination for those seeking the immediate restoration of their ancestral religious identity. Sultan Bayezid II, recognizing the strategic value of Portuguese maritime and ballistic knowledge, maintained an open entry policy for the Iberian exiles. The city of Salonika was transformed into the demographic center of this movement, eventually becoming the only city in the world with a majority Jewish population during the 16th century. These migrants brought with them advanced Portuguese techniques in metallurgy, gunpowder production, and weaving, which the Ottoman state harnessed to modernize its military and industrial sectors. The establishment of the Portuguese Kahal congregation in Istanbul and Salonika created a direct administrative link between the clandestine practitioners in Lisbon and the restored communities in the east, facilitating a continuous flow of intelligence and capital. Simultaneously, a northern route developed toward the Low Countries, specifically targeting the port of Antwerp, which served as the primary distribution hub for Portuguese spices in northern Europe. Unlike the Ottoman route, the migration to Antwerp required the maintenance of a public Christian identity, as the region was under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Habsburgs. This led to the formation of the Nação Portuguesa, Portuguese nation, a transnational merchant network that utilized the cover of international finance to move families out of the Iberian Peninsula. The Mendes Benveniste banking family became the focal point of this northern diaspora, establishing a sophisticated credit system that allowed new Christians to deposit wealth in Lisbon and retrieve it in Antwerp or Venice, effectively bypassing the royal customs inspections. The Portuguese state attempted to counter this flight through the 1504 and 1507 ordinances, which intensified the surveillance of departing vessels and increased the penalties for ship captains who transported unlicensed passengers. Despite these measures, the corruption of maritime officials and the essential role of new Christians in the royal monopolies made total enforcement impossible. By 1515, the diaspora had created a permanent triangular network connecting Lisbon, Antwerp, and the Ottoman Levant. This secret migration did not merely involve the movement of people, but the transfer of the Portuguese commercial infrastructure to rival markets. The Nação thus functioned as a state within a state, utilizing its control over the pepper and silk trades to negotiate for transit rights and temporary protections, marking the beginning of a global Sephardic network that would eventually extend to the New World. The enduring legacy of the 1497 events was defined by a multi-century period of institutional damnatio memoriae, where the Portuguese state systematically purged the Jewish presence from the national narrative. Following the formal establishment of the Inquisition in 1536, the official records of the kingdom transitioned from documenting the Sephardim as a distinct religious community to treating them as a genealogical stain within the livros de lineage books,